Good evening. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Milken Institute and this evening's discussion with Gillian Tett and John Seely Brown. They'll be talking about her new book, The Silo Effect, The Peril of Experience, and the Promise of Breaking Down Barriers. I'm Conrad Kiesel. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Institute, and we are in the middle of a very busy fall season. We had a London summit 2 weeks ago. Our Partnering for Cures meeting in New York is next week, and on December 8th, we're having our annual California Summit. We also have a lineup of 4 more forum events that you're all welcome to take part in the next 6 weeks. So many that rather than list them all now, I encourage you to go to milkeninstitute.org where you can learn all about them. After tonight's forum, you'll have a chance to buy Jillian's book, which is always important, and get her to sign a copy. Our friends at Barnes & Noble are over there, and they will be happy to take your business. And we'll do that right after the Q&A. We know that you will have great questions for Jillian, and to get to as many of them as possible, we have a system of taking electronic questions. Guys, you want to put up the slide? There it is. So please text or email questions to these addresses, and you can do that during the discussion, during the Q&A at any point. We will be taking them, sharing them, putting them on the screen so John and Jillian can get to as many of them as possible. If you don't have a cell phone, the person next to you probably does, and you can ask if you're very nice. But we have found this allows us to get to a lot more questions and have a richer, more robust discussion. Thanks. So on with the show. Our book author this evening, Gillian Tett, is the U.S. Managing Editor for the Financial Times. She also has in the past been the editor of the Capital Markets section, the Tokyo Bureau Chief, markets coverage, more than I can probably mention. She received many awards, including just last year, Columnist of the Year by the UK's Press Awards, and she's the author of 3 books. So she's very busy. And a twist you don't hear very often, Jillian has a PhD in cultural anthropology, I think, from Cambridge University, and she draws on that knowledge to really fascinating effect in this book. I think you're really going to love the book. We're delighted to have as Jillian's interviewer and interlocutor, John Seely Brown. JSB, as he is known, is a visiting scholar now at USC and the independent co-chairman of Deloitte's Center for the Edge. For many innovation-packed years, he was the chief, should I get this right? Chief research officer? No, I'm sorry, the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center Parks director and the chief scientist of Xerox. John advertises himself, as you will see if you look at his fantastic website, as the chief of confusion, helping people ask the right questions. So tonight we are looking forward to both questions from John and answers from Gillian Tett. Please welcome Gillian Tett and John Seely Brown. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, thank you.
So here's the problem. The book is huge. It's filled with many, many ideas. As you can see, almost every other page is earmarked with a question. But fear not.
I feel a bit like I'm in university confronting my lecturer
right.
with my homework.
I decided to be her anti-agent tonight because her agent says, don't tell us what got you into this field, having been a serious research anthropologist. But I'm fascinated to hear at the very beginning how you busted out of the academic silos and entered to the world of finance and understanding the world writ large in terms of the business. So I'm going to start out by asking her that question. And then, because this book is so chock full of ideas, hopefully you will kind of give us a run through of this, and then we'll open it up to questions between you and me and then the audience.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Before I start, let me just quickly say a very big thank you, first of all, to Conrad for that very kind introduction. Secondly, to the Milken Institute for hosting tonight's event. Thirdly, to JSB, who has been an intellectual hero of mine for years. In fact, I think when I grow up, I want to be JSB in terms of his wide spectrum of ideas. But fourthly, to all of you and all of you watching or listening for coming along tonight, I'm very grateful for your interest. My life story, briefly. Well, by most people's standards, I am profoundly weird. But I'm also the product of a culture and environment which is rather different from the educational world that we have our kids in today, which is that I was lucky enough to grow up in a family that had very few expectations for me and didn't really expect me to charge off and instantly find a high-flying career. On the contrary, they really wouldn't. They had very, very few expectations for me. Finishing high school and going to university was about the summit of it. I grew up like many kids with no idea what I wanted to do, except I wanted to explore the world. So I took myself off when I was in my late teens and went to Pakistan for a year and volunteered in a philanthropic venture. Then I went to college, and I studied anthropology, partly because it sounded kind of like fun. Didn't think about whether it would look good on my CV or not, thank heavens. In the course of that, I went off to Tibet for quite a lot of traveling, spent about 6-7 months in Tibet, and then came back and thought vaguely about applying for jobs. Didn't get accepted anywhere, so I did what seemed like a good escape hatch in those days, which I went off and did a PhD in cultural anthropology. Flirted briefly with doing a career in set design, so I really wasn't that directed. And I was lucky enough to end up, through various circuitous routes, in Tajikistan, which is on the border of northern Afghanistan. I was fascinated by languages, and I'd been studying a number of languages, and the reason I ended up there was simply opportunistic. The Soviet Union was breaking up. I couldn't go back to Tibet because of Tiananmen Square, so I went to Tajikistan and looked at the question of Islamic identity and the role played by women in a Tajik village. Worked high up in the mountains, just near Afghanistan. Lived with a Tajik family. Anyone here in the audience an anthropologist? Wow, that's two more than I normally get when I talk to bankers. So, anyone here who's got kids who are studying anthropology? Yeah. I often, with this kind of audience, get people who come up to me afterwards and say, well, my kid's studying anthropology, will they ever get a job? And the good news is, yes, you can get a job. But I was out in Tajikistan. I vaguely thought I might like to become a journalist. I started freelancing. And then a very brutal war happened. The Soviet Union broke up. A very, very brutal, tragic, terrible war happened in my community. And I became almost overnight a war reporter. And really initially out of human rights work and horror about what I was seeing around me. And one thing led to another, and I started writing for the FT. And this is really where the story becomes important and cuts into what you really want to know about, which is that the FT picked me up and said, right, we'd like to put you on our graduate trainee scheme. But to do that, you have to come back to London and study some economics and finance and work on our markets team. And I thought, hell, that sounds dreadful. But you know what? I'll do it. Because I thought, well, if that's the price I have to pay to go off and be a great war reporter, I will go back and work on the foreign exchange team for a while. So I went back to London, and I spent the first 2 or 3 months kind of sulking, thinking, well, as soon as this is over, I can go back to writing about important things like politics and geopolitics and things like that. And then one day I woke up and realized 2 important things. One is that, in fact, finance and economics looks very scary to people who are not trained as economists or financiers. But that's partly because looking scary kind of suits the economics profession rather well. And it's really just a jargon that anybody can understand if they set their mind to it. You know, if you can learn Tajik, which is kind of weird, or French, you can learn finance and economics. But secondly, if you don't understand how money goes around the world, you don't actually understand anything. But if you only look at how money goes around the world in terms of people who are trained to look at money, you don't understand anything either. It's a bit like looking at the human body and thinking, yes, nice pretty face, nice hair, but you don't actually know how the body works unless you look at the blood system and the inner organs. But you do not understand what a human being is if you just look at the blood. So I had this vision that if I could spend my life trying to connect up the study of how money goes around the world with how culture operates and politics operate, that could be kind of fun. So that's what I did, and that's why I'm here today.
Fantastic. You see why I wanted her to tell us how she began this amazing trip. And the many side tours you also took during that period.
Yeah, I mean, I did lots of other things along the way. I
Yeah.
sort of, worked for the FT, I ran the Lex column, I did, Tokyo Bureau and stuff, but that's kind of what the gist is.
But you also became aware of what classification systems do to you.
Yeah, I mean, well, here's the issue. For many years, when I joined the FT, one of the first people I spoke to was Martin Wolf. And are there many people in the room who read the FT, Financial Times? Yeah, great. Thank you. You're paying my salary, so thank you. Well, I remember talking to Martin Wolf and his ilk, and he said to me, you have a PhD. And I said, yes, it's in anthropology. And his face fell, and he said, not economics. And I thought, yikes, clearly being a financial journalist is not a place that likes to celebrate anthropology. And for many years, I was essentially a closet anthropologist, because I'd go and meet all these grown-up people doing big jobs in central banks or banks and running things. And it was very clear before 2008 that the subjects that people really cared about, which gave you the credibility to talk about the world, were basically things like economics and finance. You needed an MBA, you needed a PhD in astrophysics. And things like anthropology were basically quite secondary. But I happen to think that one thing that changed after the financial crisis that people haven't thought enough about is that there was this recognition that actually numbers are important, but they only get you so far. Looking at the cultural patterns that frame our lives, looking at the unspoken social rules and social structures and, in a sense, social systems that affect us all, which we rarely ever think about, is absolutely critical. And that, in a sense, is what led me to this book.
So I have to say that exactly that's what got me so fascinated, because some of us are so concerned with kind of building a world map of what's happening in the 21st century as opposed to the end of the 20th century. How has this game completely changed? What are the new categories we need to use to think about making sense now versus even 5 years ago is a new kind of a game plan. And I think many of the things you get at here help us see the world afresh in terms of shifting our ontologies or the ways we categorize things and so on and so forth. But we can get into this later. It'd be great if you would actually be willing to kind of take us through some of the key parts of your book.
Well, why I wrote this book. Let me explain, because this will bring it down to ground zero. I mean, the starting point of this book was the 2007-2008 financial crisis, when a lot of people back then, as the markets melted down and horrible things came to light, a lot of journalists, a lot of politicians assumed that the reason why the whole crisis had happened was because the bankers had all turned out to be either completely mad or completely greedy or completely evil or completely thick or all four. And I looked around and I thought, well, actually, most of the people who I know who work in finance, yes, there are some greedy people, maybe one or two are a bit mad, but most of them are not. And most of them were doing things that they thought kind of made sense within the context with which they operated. And what struck me was that the context was unbelievably fragmented. And I first started thinking about it, in fact, because when I became head of the capital markets section at the Financial Times, I couldn't understand why the bankers wanted to talk to me. I would go from one bank and they'd be kind of really curious to talk to me, and I'd go to another bank and they'd be curious to talk to me. And I'd think, well, why do they want to know my opinion about what's going on? Because I am such a total amateur when it comes to things like derivatives or CDO squared. They're the experts. Why are they asking me? And then I realized that they were living in worlds where they were very fragmented, and people sitting in one trading desk didn't have any idea what another trading desk was thinking or doing in another bank. They were desperate for information. And I suddenly thought, this is quite familiar, because in my Tajik village up in Afghanistan, there was a male quarters and there were female quarters. And I was the only person in the valley who could move between the two, because I was kind of weird. I was out of the system a bit. And they had this very fragmented view there, but I could move between them. So I used to go between the banks thinking like I was in my Tajik village. a bit like a bee in a field of, sort of flowers, collecting nectar from flower to flower to flower. And when I thought about it, that fragmented worldview and that fragmented pattern was critical to what happened in the financial crisis. It's a big missing piece that no one talks about.
Right.
Because the failure inside the banks to join up the dots and see the totality of the risks that were being run and the consequences was deadly. I mean, I tell the story in my book of UBS, but it could be Citigroup, Merrill Lynch. I mean, apologies to anyone who works from UBS, but most of these big banks were very tribal in terms of how they operated. And it wasn't just the banks, it was the regulators, the central banks, it was the media. I mean, we at the FT, we had one team who wrote about macroeconomics, and they had the big glory office overlooking the river next to the editor's office. And then we had a separate team which wrote about capital markets. And they sat on the basement floor. I ran that team. And we overlooked the garbage cans. And we were as far apart within the building as you could physically be. And that kind of reflected a mental split. We assumed, like most banks and central banks, that you had the real economy, macroeconomics, and then you had this thing called finance, and they were separate. But that failure to join up the dots was deadly. And it wasn't just in finance. I mean, I can talk a bit more if you want. I then came back to, I actually, after the financial crisis, that got me very interested in this fragmentation. And then in 2010, I moved to America, to New York, to run the American operations of the FT. And one of the first stories I had to write about, or rather, I got people to write about, was BP. And we started doing a big investigation into why it was that a bunch of bright engineers had, done things which were unbelievably stupid. And I remember looking late at night, reading all this copy, all these stories about BP, and thinking, you could replace UBS with BP and you'd have exactly the same story. Once again, bright people are doing really dumb things because of this fragmentation. So that got me, interested in asking, why does this happen, and what can we do to fix it?
Right, and you've now been able to see how that moves beyond just the world of finance, or BP is not just finance, but tell a little bit about Sony.
Well, the way one does, once I started collecting stories of silos, and I use the word silo really as a shorthand because it's easy to pronounce, and it translates well in almost every language, apart from Japanese, whereas in Japanese it's translated as takotsubo, which means octopus pot. In Sony, tragically, Howard Stringer, the head of Sony, in his first speech to the Sony staff in Tokyo, stood up and declared to the entire staff, "We must fight the silos." And the Japanese translator had never heard the word before and said in Japanese, "We must fight the octopus pots." And the entire staff went, "What?" Anyway, but yeah, no, silo the shorthand.
A tough beginning for him.
Exactly. Well, it went downhill from there on. But the point is that, I became obsessed with silos. I went, I sort of looked at the CIA and how they pre-9/11 had been stovepiped. I looked at, the White House, the story of what went wrong with the mortgage program. General Motors, classic example. Mary Barra is very articulate. But Sony is one of my favorite examples of how silos cause people to do really stupid things. Because how many of you in the audience had a Walkman growing up? Great, okay. Well, how many of you have ever wondered why you don't have a Walkman today? Okay. Well, many, if you ask people that, most people say, well, because we have the internet. Who wants to carry around a piece of hardware? And in fact, it's fascinating because actually, there's no reason, if you think about it, why we couldn't have a digital Walkman. Because if you go back to 1999, Sony had every ingredient possible to create a digital Walkman. Uniquely amongst global companies, it was running a company which not only had this hit product, the Walkman, and a brand name, it also had computing, that VAIO computing division. It had, obviously consumer electronics design. It had a music label sitting inside the company. It had content, software, hardware, content, and brand, everything. And yet it didn't. Why? Well, answer is, it tried. In late 1999, it actually launched a digital Walkman. The problem was that it actually launched 2 digital Walkman. In fact, then 3 digital Walkman. Because, true story, the company by that stage was so tribal, like UBS, like BP, that it had these different departments that were competing with each other so intensely that each department produced its own version of the digital Walkman. And guess what? They cannibalized each other. And they essentially opened the way for Apple, which was in fact a very silo-busting company at the time, to come in with the iPod, which was a very silo-busting device. And as so often, you look back at that, like with UBS or like the other stories, and say, well, how could they have been so stupid? Well, the reality is we get trapped by our mental patterns and we get lulled into this sense that these silos are normal and natural, and we can't step out.
So we know these are really hard things to overcome. There are almost no major companies that have successfully done this. But your book turns very optimistic in some very interesting stories about the struggles to say, well, maybe it's not an impossibility to bust the silos down, to connect things, but it ain't easy. And, you know, I think the 2 or 3 stories that really hit me. One is, you know, Chicago, the story, could we think the data analytics does everything, or Mike Bloomberg. And I want to come back to 2 of the stories as well as that really blew my mind the most. One is Facebook, because we always expect amazing things to be happening from those that we don't understand. And then the Cleveland hospital system, which
Right.
And I think those are really fantastic anchors for us to take away of some very optimistic points of view.
Yeah, I mean, basically, after spending time, you know, gathering together a dossier of disasters, you know, which became quite fat, you know, I then started wondering, well, hang on a sec, you know, it's very clear that silos can be deadly. But actually, the reality is not all companies blow up, thank God. You know, not all government departments end up collapsing in a disaster. On the contrary, some companies seem to be able to deal with this. And actually, when I looked across the world, it was clear to me that in many ways, companies which were actually able to jump across boundaries and rethink their silos and their classification systems were often the ones that were most innovative. I mean, one person's silo is another person's opportunity. And innovation and creativity is often about not so much thinking outside the box, to use the usual cliche, but actually reshuffling the boxes and redefining the boxes and jumping between the boxes. So I became very interested in the question of, you know, how and why that could happen. And the big picture theory, which drove me, really goes back to my anthropology, because I firmly believe that the reason why we as human beings are hardwired to have this silo problem is because we are basically, as humans, hardwired to classify the world. You know, every society that anthropologists have ever studied has a classification system, and anthropologists spend a huge amount of time, I mean, any of you who've done 101 anthropology in college will know this, looking at classification. You know, classification is culture and culture is classification. And the reason for that, in some ways, is very obvious, because you know, we are all surrounded by so much data and information and processes and people, we have to have a way to order the world. And it's out of that silos arise. But the key point to understand is that anthropologists might know that classification is a human universal, but we don't all classify the world in exactly the same way. You know, one of the great powers of anthropology is that actually when you look around the world, you can see there are many ways to actually organize your mental boxes. And another great thing about anthropology is that what anthropologists do is not just look at how societies connect, not just look bottom up at societies, not just look at the gap between rhetoric and reality, although that's a very important part. Anthropologists also know that one of the most powerful ways to understand your social context is to go and study the other, a different culture and different society. Not simply so that you can understand something that seems alien, but so that you can look back at yourself and see just how darn weird you are to someone else. Because everybody thinks that the way that they live, their mental maps, their classification system is inevitable and natural, and everyone else is kind of weird. And it's not until you walk in someone else's shoes you realize not just that we're all weird, but the gaps and the problems in your own classification system. So to cut to the chase, I really think that one of the first stepping points to dealing with silos is, one, to think about your classification system, to recognize that you're classifying the world without even realizing it. Fish don't talk about water. We don't talk about classification. But you need to start off thinking about that. And then to recognize actually there are probably problems arising from that, and start thinking about alternatives. And when I look, and that's the end of the theory part, the practical part is when I looked around the world today, I saw some really interesting and exciting examples of companies which were essentially doing that, and institutions and individuals, often without using the word anthropology, although I told them, you're an anthropologist, you don't realize it, you are. But there are things you can do. So I can talk about them if you want, but Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, in the world of medicine, is a fascinating example of a hospital which has tried to turn its mental map of medicine upside down in a way that has real messages for other disciplines too.
But I think the struggle that actually was involved in making that transformation is very informative.
Well, shall I tell the story briefly of Cleveland Clinic? I mean, we are sitting in the the Milken Institute, so kind of relevant. How many of you in the audience are doctors? Any of you doctors? Trained in medicine? No. Okay, interesting. Well, Cleveland Clinic is fascinating because for the last 150 years, medicine has been shaped by a very rigid taxonomy, classification system, which basically is divided into three key parts. There are people who get paid to cut up other people, and they're called surgeons. There are people who don't cut up other people, and they're called physicians. And then there's a kind of support crew, nurses, etc., etc. And that is a very rigid distinction that's been in medicine.
Yes.
And that's a fundamental basis on which hospitals are organized. And that's how doctors essentially and medical staff are trained. And in addition to that, most doctors assume that the issue of technical skills in medicine is separate from emotion or mind or spirit. So those are the distinctions that doctors tend to have. And what Cleveland Clinic said a few years ago is, well, that taxonomy is very convenient for doctors, but it's not actually how patients perceive the world. I mean, there's a separate issue, which is basically medicine is so fragmented, a bit like banks, that one of the reasons why healthcare costs are so high in America today is because you get in crazy duplication and lack of coordination. But, the Cleveland Clinic guy said, well, actually, if you are a human being, a consumer, a patient, walking into a hospital, you don't say, I'd like to see a cardiothoracic surgeon, please. You say, my heart hurts, or I have a headache, or I feel a bit bad. And you as a patient don't distinguish between how you feel and the technical skills of medicine, and things like that. So Cleveland Clinic said, well, what would happen if we were to reimagine medicine around body parts and ailments and put surgeons and physicians and nurses on a par? Very simple idea in some ways, completely radical in terms of how medicine is organized. But they went out and did that. It's a long story. I won't tell it. It's in my book. It was a very tough story, tough battle, still very controversial, but it appears to have delivered very interesting results for Cleveland Clinic, not just because they forced the doctors and the surgeons and physicians to work together on a par. They made the surgeons start thinking about the whole experience of medicine. They sent them off to Disneyland for lessons in customer care, and that was quite a shock. But the whole idea of just trying to rethink your mental map, and that idea can be applied to almost any field. If you look at a modern company, industrial company, and said, well, if we were focused on the problem we're trying to solve, or how customers see the world, how would we actually organize ourselves, and how would that change our tribal structures? And could that make us collaborate better?
Almost a complete flip of how you see the world.
Exactly. I mean, you've done that a lot, and I should come back to you actually, because those of you who don't know, JSB has been absolutely at the forefront of trying to not just provoke a very interdisciplinary debate and form a research at the Palo Alto Research Center, where you worked both with scientists and social scientists and anthropologists.
Yeah.
I mean, you had computer scientists and anthropologists sitting together, which, I mean, talk about breaking down tribal boundaries. I mean, that was pretty profound. But you've been looking a lot at the question of design and how companies and institutions design their spaces and get trapped into these very rigid ways of thinking.
Yeah, I was really struck. I mean, one of the things that really comes out, I mean, Xerox PARC was unusual because in my lab, or my center, 250 people or so, we had everybody from theoretical physicists, mathematicians, computer scientists, all the way through to philosophers, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists. The philosopher was the hardest problem. And the real question was, with that kind of matrix, you don't just say, let's call a meeting and get people together and talk. They don't show up. So you really have to go to the ground level, so to speak, to see how you're going to really get any productivity. Productive friction really happens.
So how did you break down those silos inside PARC?
Three simple ways. I mean, they're so trivial. I'm going to come back to it with Facebook. I want to talk about it in a moment. It has done a truly skillful job. The recognition was we all like to eat. So I said, okay, we're going to have the world's best cafeteria, but we're going to have this cafeteria filled with these very long tables. And so no way could just your tribe eat at one table. And so we set things up so tribes would share tables.
Wow.
So there were almost no 2 or 4 person tables. You had to be in 16 person tables. And everybody got to listen to everybody else. And they all came because there was damn good food and it was more or less semi-free. Back in those days, that really meant something. So that started the conversation going. Then, because we were kind of pioneering things like Internet of Things, although this was the mid-'80s, we did something that was truly pathological. We put the coffee pot on the network. So that any time anybody brewed a fresh pot of coffee, that would flash across the Ethernet, across the whole building. And to be able to get a fresh pot of coffee, so people would come streaming out of their offices to grab this fresh pot of coffee, okay? So we'd have a collision space, okay? By design, okay? And you go into a bit different way. But around this collision space, we had wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling whiteboards. And so basically you would hang out with nice couches and start scribbling. With magic markers and so on and so forth. Sound familiar, Rand? So you would actually scribble on these things. And then we had ways to automatically capture those scribbles and map them back to our workstations.
Well, you see, I think this is fascinating because I do believe that architecture
It's
is absolutely key. I mean, I noticed when I went around my little voyage looking for silo-busting people, that time and again I stumbled across architects because I think the sheer act of having to think about how you plan space makes you start to think about the mental boxes that we have inside our heads that we never question. Architecture forces you to think about how you classify the world and then to challenge that. But the other thing was I saw when I went around the companies that a number of the companies which were trying to silo bust were using space to not just drag people out of their corners, but also to try and create space for unplanned collisions and those moments of serendipity. So, I mean, Cleveland Clinic, for example, they have these long tunnels which connect the buildings because guess what? It's horrible weather most of the time. And they're protected walkways and tunnels. And the staff used to think that was a complete waste of space and, just kind of ignored the tunnels. And then they realized that actually what the tunnels were doing was funneling people from across the hospital, and they collided, often physically, with each other as they rushed around. And people started saying, well, actually, it's actually a really powerful tool for serendipity. The fact that you have to be funneled into these spaces, when it's like horrible weather outside, which I found fascinating. I mean, Facebook, which I'll come and tell in a minute, but they have a very deliberate plan to create open spaces on the campus to force people to collide with each other. They're so obsessed with this that they've actually put these walkways between the buildings in Facebook with supermarket doors that open automatically. And the idea is that the poor Facebook people never have to stop to open a door. They just keep moving and colliding and mingling. It's a bit gimmicky, but it gets a point. But Bloomberg, I tell the story of Bloomberg and Michael Bloomberg at City Hall. And one of the things he did when he arrived in City Hall in New York, which, like most government buildings, is a complete siloized nightmare, big bureaucracy. He looked at these little kind of what he called marble rabbit hutches, where all the city officials had worked, traditional tiny offices, and said, right, I want everyone out of their rabbit hutches and into the same space to work together. And because the municipal building in New York is very old, there was no big open space. It's not like a Wall Street bank. And the only space you could find was the speaker's hall, which traditionally had been used for meetings. So he literally took it over, and he forced all the senior officials to come out of their rabbit hutches. They gave them desks next to each other, together with, the infamous Bloomberg fish. And they sat around, and literally he sat in the middle, and everybody could hear everyone else's conversations. And the idea was that by using architecture, he was trying to break down those boundaries.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Architects think about two particular things. They think about negative space as well as positive space.
Yes.
They flip the space inside out. It's exactly what the Cleveland Clinic did. But in terms of the patient point of view, the negative space of that is a doctor point of view. So that whole sense of flipping spaces, but they also think deeply about flow.
It's what, they think about flow. I would say on the negative space, anthropologists do that too, because anthropologists are trained to not just listen to what people say,
Right.
but what they don't say.
Right.
And what I call these social silences are often crucial in terms of not just fixing the social map in our lives in a way that we become slaves to, but reproducing the power structure. Anyway.
Yep, no, absolutely. But I want to go one step further, because a lot of these ideas of how to play some of these games of busting, silos, et cetera. So in today's world, the 21st century, so many of the classic forms of categorizing things are really being challenged. Even what do we mean by work, I might point out, is a categorization that now is under debate, what that might mean. But I want to kind of have you talk a little bit about the Facebook in terms of how they organize work, because I think it's one of the most clever ideas yet to orchestrate serendipity, both locally and more globally.
Yeah. Well, I just say, Facebook recognizes something which is central to my book, which is that if you're confronted with a silo problem, it's very easy to say, well, let's abolish silos, get rid of them, no silos. And the reality is that's very tempting, but it's ridiculous.
Yep.
As we'd say in the English slang, it's bollocks. Because silos, are inherent to the human condition. And in a sense, we need silos to exist and operate. And they can make companies more efficient. We can't all be doing the same thing at once. So Facebook's very interesting because they recognize that they need silos in the sense of dedicated project teams.
Right.
They need small little units to do specific tasks. You can't have all the computer engineers doing the same thing at once. But they also want to stop them hardening into tribes like they did at Sony. So what they do is create these dedicated teams and then spend a lot of time trying to make sure that they don't harden into silos by constantly doing three things. Firstly, keeping the boundary of the teams very porous by moving people around, rotating them. Secondly, by trying to ensure that they collide with each other the whole time. They don't just have that in architecture, they also have it with things like hackathons, where they force everyone to work together all night somewhere and to work with somebody from another team. So they collide with each other. And thirdly, they try very hard to create social ties that overlap the teams to stop them becoming one-dimensional and tribal. So when people join Facebook, they actually force everybody to go on a common, what they call boot camp experience for 6 weeks, supposedly to learn code, but that's just a fig leaf. In reality, they try and create this cohort experience, which means that when they then scatter to different teams, they still have social ties that connect the teams. And they have rules which say things like, you're not allowed to refer to other people by anything other than the first name, so that you can't say things like those idiots in Team 6, because that creates stereotypes and tribalism. So the theory is that you need units, but you need to find ways to stop those units from becoming one-dimensional. And it's a good philosophy to try and use more broadly, I think.
Yep. So I really encourage you to take a look at this, because I live in Silicon Valley.
Sorry.
Can you get it okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And, in Silicon Valley, we live in geekdom. But I have to say that even every other year, I see fundamentally new things happening in terms of organizational architectures of how we work with people and him, And I was fascinated by that chapter. I was freaked out by it at first. I said, God, I couldn't work that way. And then I said, well, there's something very exciting about this.
But you see, one of the key things, and this really cuts the point that JSB's done a lot of work on, which is this question of having slack and space to play,
Right.
and space to be creative. Those of you who don't know, JSB runs as a consultancy looking at this very issue about how you actually get innovation amongst people jumping across boundaries on the edge.
Right.
And the common thread of the companies I looked at and the people who were trying to break down silos was that they recognized that actually to break out of the very rigid mental structures that we tend to inherit, you need to have a little bit of slack in your life or your organization to actually to roam, to collide with the unexpected, to think fresh thoughts. I mean, for Facebook, actually organizing hackathons, and rotating people is kind of time consuming. For Cleveland Clinic, reorganizing the clinic and dealing with this complicated structure of, doctors, surgeons, body parts and stuff is time consuming. And for people's lives, having the ability to frankly do what I did, which is to jump across careers and boundaries, or do what you did, or just even having the ability to find space to roam and to try and put yourself in someone else's shoes, or to simply think out of your normal box, takes time. And one of the things that really worries me today is that we as a society put so much emphasis on efficiency and streamlining, almost at all costs, everywhere from education. Most kids today couldn't do what I did, and just go and sort of roam vaguely in their career for a few years and then stumble on, being lucky enough to find, a path. Most kids couldn't do what Steve Jobs did, drop out, go and study Japanese calligraphy, and then 10 years later do IT, and suddenly, 15 years later, join up the dots and use his Japanese calligraphy to design all those beautiful, Apple Macs. Having that space to roam a bit is very hard. And if you're running a public company today, trying to justify to the outside world having a bit of slack is fantastically difficult. It's one reason why, what you're championing in terms of, in praise of slack is so important. But it's tough to defend.
It is, unless you have to live on innovation.
Yeah, unless you...
and then you suddenly find out that if you don't have that slack in the system, you're never going to get a radically new type of idea.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, innovation comes from jumping across silos. And by the way, in a field like finance, all the best money-making wheezes tend to come across also by jumping across silos. I mean, the counterpart to UBS and the fact that rigid bank silos distorted asset prices in crazy ways is that some savvy financiers, who are often but not always in hedge funds, start silo busting, and they find a way to arbitrage, i.e. make money off the back of those rigidities. I tell the story in my book of UBS and then Blue Mountain Capital. It's kind of yin and yang if you want to be Californian about it.
And yet make a lot of money.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
the Blue Mountain story.
We are in the Milken Institute.
I will say that kind of one thing for many of us in this room, being multiple generations older than the kids that go to Facebook, I'm fond of saying, like, how much time do we spend getting out of our own comfort zone? Because if you don't get out of your own comfort zone, there's just no way of seeing a new kind of classification system, number one. And two, is take seriously the role of reverse mentorship. We have a lot to learn from today's youngsters. And I think that you talk about something that's abrasive at time. It can be shocking, but it is completely different kinds of categorization schemes. And actually being able to play with that, so to speak, you actually start to kind of shift your eigenvectors, or your lens, conceptual lens,
Completely.
in very powerful ways, and something that all of us in this room can actually do, both of those things, surprisingly profitably. But let's actually bring in the audience and see what kinds of questions
Let's
we
see if the
have,
technology works.
which means,
You can all grab your cell phone or grab a neighbor's cell
Yeah.
phone. Shall we get ready?
yes, we should get ready for questions. Thank you. I'm getting good instructions.
Okay.
Yeah, well, you gave Apple's a silo-busting company. One might argue that Steve Jobs ran Apple in a Napoleonic manner. Is a Napoleonic leader necessary to have a silo-free company?
Really brilliant question.
Yes,
And very clever question. And my answer is, it's not the only way to have a silo-busting company at all, but it is one way. And the thing about Steve Jobs is, it's very interesting. I mean, he really had 2 or 3 key elements of his approach, which were important in this story. Firstly, he believed very strongly that you should only ever have 6 products. In fact, Apple may be breaking that now, but which meant that whenever a new product cropped up, he tried to kill something else off. Very, very, very hard to do. I mean, Sony became like this sort of multi-headed hydra where they kept creating more and more products and more departments.
Yeah,
and
look
became
at
more
Lisa
and more
versus
fragmented.
Max.
Yeah, and tragically, at one stage, Howard Stringer tried to show the Sony staff how dangerous it was. You know, they had 2 or 3 dozen plugs for their products at one stage, none of which interacted because they were so fragmented. And he did a display case to show the staff all the products that Sony made in order to shock them into changing and killing things off. And in fact, it had quite the opposite effect, because when the staff looked at all their products, they kind of went, wow, we've done all of that? That's brilliant. And the problem is, the serious point is that when a company has lots of hit products, you get teams and tribes that are invested and incentivized to defend that past success and defend those boundaries. And it takes someone strong like Steve Jobs to actually smash that down and say, no, we are going to kill that product because it's out of date. But the second thing that Steve Jobs did was to recognize that when you have rapid technological change, the outside world can converge and break down boundaries faster than the internal boundaries of a company can.
Absolutely.
So what happened with the iPod, was that basically iPod and iTunes involved bringing together software, content, and hardware and computing skills in incredibly creative ways. And if you had a company which had a software department, a hardware department, and a content department, you couldn't do it. But he kind of smashed them together. So it's not the only way to do it, but it is one way.
If you want electronic communications, how about giving us the information? We haven't had the phone number.
Oh, good point. I don't have the number either. Yeah, no, somebody has. Yeah. Is it coming?
Why can't we just raise our hands?
Maybe one of the organizers can.
323-863-5166.
Oh, there it is. or the org. The one last thing about the Steve Jobs, which is very surprising, is he did not believe in customer research. In doing
customer research.
In focus groups. He actually was driven by a deep sense of taste, and said, "I'm inventing things that you don't yet know about. So why do I care what you're actually thinking in terms of And so there's a whole sense of he had to count on the kinds of things that he did through calligraphy to go to the kind of essence of what was going on. And
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite Steve Jobs quotes, which kind of is my mantra for life, is that you can't join up the dots looking forward. You can only join them up looking back.
right.
And you can't join up the dots looking forward. You can only join them up looking back. And he said that in his 2005 commencement speech at
That's true.
Stanford University.
Yep.
And for me, having had a really weird background, the story about how his calligraphy, Japanese calligraphy, was combined with his computing passion to subsequently inspire his designs for, the Apple Mac and the iPod and stuff, I find incredibly inspiring because, when I look back, I never set out when I was a weirdo anthropologist studying Tajikistan to do something which I could then connect to derivatives years later. But, I was lucky enough to find a way to connect the dots of my life. And something I really feel strongly is that we need to tell the kids of our generation, or the next generation, to sometimes have the courage to chase different dots and to have the confidence that eventually that Steve Jobs philosophy will turn out. It's a tough thing to do as a parent, but I do believe strongly that if we end up streamlining kids and telling them that they have to follow just one tiny little bucket in their lives, we end up creating a very one-dimensional and society and fragmented world.
Fantastic point. So we're now being asked if you could clue us more in about Mayor Bloomberg's approach, and how could that approach actually be applied to perhaps the national government as well as he applied it so brilliantly to the city?
You mean try and rip the whole of Congress and Senate out of their marble rabbit hutches into an open plan office? I often think
You don't have an opinion, do you?
I often think if you gave everyone in Congress and the Senate dogs and told them all to go dog walking together, that would be one way to break down silos very, very fast. Anyone who's got dogs will know that dogs are the ultimate silo buster. You walk along the streets with a dog and you collide with all kinds of unexpected people and you talk to them. It's great. More seriously, I mean, what Mike Bloomberg did in New York was, in fact, very mixed in its success. Yes, he ripped down the architecture. He then discovered it was almost impossible to get the silos of the different departments to actually be broken down very effectively. A large part of the problem was the unions and the fact that you had these very deeply entrenched unions that didn't want job descriptions to be broken down because it was linked to power. Oddly enough, one of the greatest successes he had involved not unions, not people, but data. And the story that I tell in my book is actually about something that happened towards the end of his time, that a rather innovative group of data scientists came in and were given the task of trying to help the city get better at predicting which buildings were going to go up in flames and kill people. And the problem they faced was that the fire department data was terrible, because traditionally the people who call 311 in New York are not the people who live in fire hazard areas. They're the rich people. Poor immigrants in places like Queens don't call 311, obviously. So that data was useless. But people until that point had only ever looked at firefighting in terms of fire department data. So what these data scientists said was, well, what happens if we take data from other departments and map it together and try and see what happens? So they took data on brick deliveries, vermin, building codes, mortgage defaults, put them together, and lo and behold, their firefighting prediction abilities, or their fire hazard prediction abilities, went up 5-fold at a stroke with no extra cost. Big thing. So then they started applying it to other areas of New York City, and my favorite example is the yellow grease problem. Any of you know what yellow grease is? It is the disgust.
You don't want to.
Yeah, well, tell you now before dinner. Yellow grease is what you get in a deep fryer when you've cooked food in a restaurant for other people. And there's a lot of it in New York because there are a lot of restaurants. And in theory, restaurants are supposed to pay a waste disposal company to take it away. In practice, many don't because it costs money and because they've watched The Sopranos and they know what waste disposal companies in New York do. So traditionally, many of them have got rid of it by pouring it down the manholes. And they usually do that at 3 o'clock in the morning, and no one can catch them. And so New York City sewage is full of yellow grease. And so they applied the same principle to spotting yellow grease dumpers as they used for firefighting, and discovered that, yes, if you used combined data from different departments, you got much better prediction. And the key point is this: once they had that combined data, not only was that actually very silo-busting in itself, and as they were fond of saying, it's much easier to combine data than people because data doesn't have a union. It's true. But they then used that combined result to work backwards and to force the people in the departments to start collaborating in new ways. And in particular, they launched a program and they went to the yellow grease dumpers, or the suspected yellow grease dumpers, and said, have you ever heard of the biodiesel industry? Because we have a recycling program in New York which had never spoken to the restaurant team before. Why don't we work together? And it's a classic win-win, and it is unbelievably obvious when you look back in retrospect, and yet nobody had ever thought of it before because of those mental silos.
Yeah. And
Sorry,
I just add one other thing to that story to me is because what is very interesting is that that group that Bloomberg allowed to be formed had a real old-timer, well-experienced from Iraq days, Flower by name,
Mike Flowers,
Mike Flowers.
yeah.
And his idea was to go out and hire 3 or 4 young geeks, 23, 24, 25 years old, and kind of recognizing the wisdom of how to deal with administration he had, but to unleash the kind of generative data hacking capabilities of the youngsters. And they kind of formed a very interesting team that knew how to really attack problems that nobody ever thought possible, almost with no money. I mean, 3 or 4 people was nothing. And yet
they did what you talk about, reverse mentoring.
Yeah.
I mean, he came from a military background. Oddly enough, a number of the silo buses I found came from military backgrounds, because I think the crisis of war forces people out of their comfort zone.
Right.
But he also reverse mentored, as you say.
Yep, good. So next question is, how can a brand new company actively avoid suffering from the silo effects?
Okay, well, 2 answers. One is, I mean what I say, that one person's silo is another person's opportunity. And much of the disruption in the world that occurs with startups is about silo busting, or silo busting other companies, point 1. Point 2 is to recognize that success tends to lead to rapid growth, which tend to lead without thinking to silos. And Facebook, one of the reasons why Facebook is so red hot and thinking about silos is because they looked very early on in the company's history at something called the Dunbar number, which is a theory by Robin Dunbar that we are only hardwired as humans, given the size of our brain, to cope with 150 social relationships. And originally, Facebook looked at that to try and understand how many people they should design for with our Facebook friendship circles. And then they realized it had implication for how they were operating, because as they exploded in size in 2007 and 8, they suddenly realized that their engineers were about to breach the Dunbar principle. And that's one of the things that made them think, well, actually, history shows that whenever companies get to more than 150, they start to become bureaucratic. So they set out on their breakthrough plan. So second point is, if you are a fast-growing startup and you're breaching that Dunbar principle, think about silos. And the third point is, I'd say, is hire an anthropologist.
You mean like Uber does?
Well, exactly. Hey, my book is basically a job creation scheme for anthropologists. And but actually, there's a very serious point there. Is that oddly enough, coming back to the question I'm usually asked by audiences like you, I have a kid who wants to study anthropology. Will they ever get a job? Actually, right now, it's a better time to be an anthropologist than ever before.
Absolutely.
Because there are a lot of companies that are hiring anthropologists.
And we're all confused.
Well, exactly.
No, seriously.
Yeah, no, I mean, the kind of work that you're doing, linking together, science and social sciences is
so kind of adding on to that, how can a company kind of detect that ahead of time that it's falling into this trap so they can kind of get ahead of the curve and fix it before it gets set in cement?
Well, I would say, I mean, you should answer that question yourself, but, I would argue that, look at how fast they're swelling, look at whether people are starting to refer to each other as those idiots in Team 6. Look at whether you have an incentive structure, which is basically incentivizing people to only care about the little team, not the wider society. Those are some of the keys. What would you say?
Pray. No, I mean,
look at your design solutions.
Yeah. I mean, there is something very interesting, by the way, believe it or not, in running these things. They sound bad, but these hackathons. And I've moved into, into Asia, which is the last place you'd think I'd ever running hackathons, with some of the most senior companies over there, and actually getting the 23 and 24-year-olds out, completely self-organizing, and then bringing the senior team together to watch what these guys have figured out and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of things you can do to kind of fix these problems, but it starts by being alert.
Yeah.
And the real catch is, as you point out brilliantly in your book, you're pretty much unaware of your own classification system.
It starts by being a fish and thinking about water.
Right.
It really is that simple.
Right.
I mean, one of my favorite tests that you can all do is, okay, you may be too old for this, but who in the room is on Twitter? Okay, it's a West Coast crowd. Great. You ask that question, in the Midwest, and they kind of go, Twitter? But if you are on Twitter, it's worth asking yourself, look at the Twitter feed that you have created. And I bet you the majority of the Twitter feeds, people you're following on Twitter, are people just like you. Because I strongly believe, it's one of my passionate sort of theories in life, and it comes out of watching my own daughters. I have two daughters, 10 and 11, that we live today in Generation C, Generation Customization, where as a result of technology, we have the ability to customize our world with more power than anybody in history has ever managed to do before. And what that means is that although we have these clever cell phones and other devices which appear to connect us, we are selecting ourselves into customized tribes and groups, which are actually more fragmented than ever before. I first started thinking about Generation C because my daughters kept going to Starbucks for the secret menu in Starbucks. And you realize that this idea of customizing your drink to the nth degree sort of captures how we all are. But if you look at Twitter, ask yourself, have I customized myself on Twitter into a tiny social tribe? And most importantly, what would happen if I was to knock out half or 2/3 of the people who I follow and replace them with people who are radically different? Right. A Chinese activist, a Donald Trump supporter. Some people find this offensive, but someone who actually is sympathetic to ISIS. I know this sounds very radical, but if you spend a week trying to look at the world through someone else's eyes and walk in someone else's shoes, you're basically doing anthropology in an amateur way and trying to get out of your skin and look back at yourself.
And in fact, you predicted this next question, I think, is, how...
oh, great.
How can we as individuals break free of our own ideological silos, which is going to become increasingly more important, I think, as we walk forward.
Yeah, other than study anthropology. You might have got that point by now. And by the way, on the anthropology issue, I think that academic anthropology departments don't really do anthropology a great service sometimes because they can be very tribal too. I happen to believe that actually borrowing the precepts of anthropology is often the key crucial thing. I love anthropologists. I love the academic discipline, but I don't like the tribalism of the academic world.
And how to break that is kind of interesting as well.
Universities tragically can often be tribal.
Right. So the next question I think
this is one
supposed to
you.
ask
Okay,
me.
I'm going to ask this. Okay, John, JSB. Here's a question for you. Start of a 10. Is it true that Steve Jobs stole the visual interface from Xerox PARC?
He creatively borrowed it. It's actually a fairly long story, but that's why I know so much about his calligraphy, because you got to ask, how did he walk in and within 5 minutes, understand the value of what he saw when all the top management out of Xerox that would flow through us never kind of saw the potential why that could strike a resonant chord that nobody ever talked about already. So the popular story is, Steve walked in and borrowed the interface from the slightly more longer story that's actually kind of interesting is actually Xerox understood a lot of what we were doing in PARC in terms of inventing the personal computer and the graphic user interface, blah, 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 would not ever flow through our market channels. And so the decision was to actually do a deal with Apple. Let's say, we'll take a percentage of your company, or buy it, sell it to us for almost nothing. And when Steve came in, we owned a moderate chunk of Apple. That story isn't told much because Xerox CFO about 2 years later sold it. And so it's much easier to make us at Park look stupid than to tell Wall Street maybe our CFO doesn't understand innovations.
Ouch.
But that story's all now out. So I mean, it's 30 years ago. But it was. But I was always struck. I mean, I knew Steve. Actually, he lived down the street from me in Palo Alto. You know, his genius of being able to cut to the core of seeing the aesthetics of something. And you know, he knew. I mean, he in his gut would resonate on something, that was really awesome. To see
But that cuts to the point which, you know, you talk about. I'm going to wave your book actually because you've been waving mine, which is basically the pragmatic imagination, which is John's new book, which he's co-written as
With
part
Anne,
of
yeah.
with Anne, as part of a sort of broader volume of theories, looking at the question of design and how you get people to think out of their mental boxes and break down silos. I mean, you know, for whatever reason, he had the ability to think outside the box.
Absolutely.
And the question is, how do we all replicate that in our everyday lives and in companies?
Right. But, you know, I think we all are going to develop our own little, I'm going to call them hacks. I mean, I'm really fond of saying, like, how much time do we spend out of our own comfort zone? You know, one of your examples is how many of us that don't follow one person, that don't follow Trump because of other reasons, should. And as you know, I look at ISIS for a different reason now. But I mean, there's a certain sense of saying you got to kind of marinate in kind of the real world.
Yeah.
And that real world is sometimes completely at odds with your own real world. So there's a gap in worlds. And so you have to marinate in the other world in order to start to get a feeling of what their world is, so you can look back in your world and so on and so forth. And I just think with this exponential speed we're living in today, the importance of each of us, of the age groups in this room especially, you know, taking some time to say, no, let's get out of the things we find so comfortable, and how do we really understand something else? And I think it's
It's very, very
easy.
tough. I mean, you know, it's very tough. I mean, one of the stories I tell in my book is of an extraordinary man who, in fact, who I saw on Sunday, oddly enough, in Chicago, who was one of the people who was very senior and very successful at Open Table, the restaurant website. And after a few years of working in the tech sector, 9/11 happened, and he suddenly got hit by this feeling that there is more to life
Right.
than just helping rich people go to restaurants. And he said, I want to do public service, something for a period. And his friend said, okay, fine, go and, you know, deliver hot meals to poor people in the winter. And he said, no, I want to do something else. And he got this almost inexplicable desire to go and volunteer for the police. So he volunteered for the Chicago Police Department as a trainee and went and actually spent, at the age of 31, several years of his life working for the Chicago Police Force, you know, down on the south side in a really gritty area. Complete cultural shock. I mean, talk about getting out of your comfort zone. I mean, shocking, shocking, shocking. But again, a bit like Steve Jobs, he did that without expecting to ever join up the dots of his life. As it happened, fast forward 5 years, and he ended up bringing together the tech stuff he'd done in Open Table with his experience of being on the police force in a squad car and creating a system that actually was very innovative for predicting murder. And then took that to New York City, to Chicago City Hall, and developed all these kind of innovative systems for government. And these days, amongst other things, he's now back in the tech sector. He's kind of on a crusade to persuade young techie wannabe Mark Zuckerbergs to go and spend a year or two of their life working for government. Not because it's going to be a lot of fun, because it is actually a way to actually give back. I mean, heavens only knows, government today needs innovation and the kind of energy you get from young techies desperately. And the point he makes is to these young techies is that, yes, it's going to be a culture shock. You know, guess what? They don't all hang around in T-shirts and sneakers and stuff. They will think you're weird, but that's probably quite good for you to be told you're weird. You might learn something else by getting out of your comfort zone, which you can then take back. And it's very tough, but if you can do that, it can be incredibly liberating.
In fact, if you deconstruct your story a little bit more, as you have in the chapter, he purposely chose the toughest part of Chicago
Yeah,
to become a junior cop.
yeah.
He could have been assigned, given his background, all kinds of soft places, But
Yeah.
where he actually chose, I know.
He's an unusual character. I mean, I saw him on Sunday, and he's an unusual character. I've got a huge respect for him. He's not one of life's, Starsky and Hutch macho kind
Right.
at all. He'd never touched a gun before. And to this day, when, I asked him unplanned on a stage in Chicago to come up and say a few words, and he kind of almost went scarlet. He's not a natural public extrovert or public speaker at all. And for a man like that to do that is pretty astonishing.
I think several of your stories actually are interesting stories of leadership. If you actually look at the leadership involved with the guy at Cleveland, medical system. I mean, that was unbelievable leadership.
Yeah, Toby Cosgrove.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, and this guy in Chicago. They were both, to me, they could be phenomenal leadership stories as well.
But I'll just leave with one other thought, which I think is very relevant to people around today, is that, I think most of us, when we look at our lives today, we recognize this silo problem without being able to articulate it.
But once
We
you do,
recognize the paradox that we live in a world that we think is hyper-connected, but actually we are very fragmented. And I think that one of the signs that we recognize it without being able to articulate it is the fact that the conference business today is exploding. I mean, if you think about it logically, there should be no reason why anybody ever travels anywhere to go to a conference. But one reason they do is because people want to find ways to collide with other people. If you look at teen literature, with a 10 and 11-year-old, I do, and look at the kind of themes coming out of tweenie and teen literature today, a lot of it's dystopian, or about dystopian societies, and a lot of it is actually about the problem of putting people into rigid boxes. Insurgent, divergent, anyone who's got kids here will recognize this. Go back and look at the books your kids are reading, and they kind of howls of protest against this idea that we all have to be regimented and siloized the whole time.
Yep.
So,
we have a fantastic, close to our last question, but it does get at almost a paradox in some senses. The question is, how do you bust silos if department heads are spread out around the country and decision makers telecommute?
well, hire an anthropologist. No, I'm joking. But I mean, I think there's no shortcut to physical meetings. Oops, sorry, I keep doing this, don't I? No shortcut to physical meetings. I think you need to recognize that cyber is fantastic in many ways. It can connect us incredibly. It can also let us self-segregate and become very one-dimensional in our communications. And variety, I'd say, is probably the spice of life. And trying to recognize that you can, have telecommuting and things through product-based discussions, but also having geographic connectivity is, best, is my
Right.
view.
It
What
is.
do you say? I mean, you
No, I mean, I think
go
it's an incredibly interesting question because I don't think we have really good answers for that. And yet, the way to do some new type of telecommuting is getting to be a case that you almost feel togetherness. And so, I think we're going to find some technological solutions coupled to more anthropological solutions that are going to help us do this. And one of the things that we're doing actually here with some friends here in the is it's also surprising you get a group of people together that just actually in front of whiteboards, you have them shoulder to shoulder writing stuff on the board.
Yeah.
There is something about that physicality of writing on whiteboards that also is kind of almost magical. I mean, and for a high-tech geek like me, I first of all, I laughed at that idea, and then it turns out I was 100% wrong, and my colleague Anne got me educated. But yeah, it's
I think finding ways, borrowing from the Facebook principle and finding ways to do shared projects with people and finding short-term projects that people can work on, even if it's just overnight, and getting people to do things, not just talk, but to do together, I think is profound. And for me, the equivalent of Facebook hackathons, where you basically take engineers from different teams and tell them to sit together and write code together, which actually is more important than sitting around saying, please, can you sit there and communicate? Actually writing code together is more profound. I mean, for us as journalists at the FT, we often have our most creative moments when we take people from around the world and work together on stories and co-write something. Are we almost out of time?
Last question. Can silo busting be a grassroots movement if senior management doesn't get it? Tips to make change happen from the bottom up?
Yeah, funnily enough, that's a
Good
question
question.
I get asked a lot by government, people working in government bureaucracies. The answer is it's tough. And we can all, I firmly believe that you can't silo bust just by having a leader issue orders and just by having a management consultancy handbook. But it's also tough to do it bottom up if you are locked in a rigid structure. And if your structure and if your leadership is so siloized that actually there is no scope for thinking outside the box or challenging it, I always suspect you might want to get out and remember the principle that one company's silo is another company's opportunity.
Yeah, that really does play out.
I mean, the reason why Blue Mountain, the hedge fund, created the hedge fund is partly out of the experience of working inside a bank.
But I also say, if you think about how do you work on the edge, if you use today's exponential technologies.
Yeah, actually, I should talk about,
small moves, smartly made, can make huge things happen. And surprisingly, the number of stories in your book are done by 3 and 4 people.
Yes.
This is not an impossible thing.
I mean, this is actually more of a question for you, because on the edge, what you've been doing with your sort of consultancy and your movement, it's really looking at how big companies can actually try and foster innovation on the edge in sort of ways that don't disrupt the entire organization, but create enough space for
Right, precisely.
free thinking.
And back to that space to play. So we're...
Ma'am, I don't mean to interrupt this.
I'm afraid we're going to have to.
I feel that in the context of a conversation about silos, this box, where all the questions have been funneled, has been one of the most astringent silos.
Right.
I have no idea who said what. I have no opportunity to go afterwards to say, ma'am, sir, I loved your comment. Tell me more about what you said. There has been a total freezing of the human interaction that could have occurred.
Right. Well,
I'd like to thank everybody here for great questions, and we've put a number of them, as many as we could, up there. Thank you for them. The fact that we had as many good questions shows that this conversation sparked some great thought among all of you. So thank you for that. But especially like to thank John Seeley Brown and Gillian Tett. Please join me in thanking them.
right. Thank you. Well, thanks to you. Thank you.
Jillian's time is a little tight, so anyone who wants to get a book and get a signature from the author, please get over to the book stand right away.